Okay, so, this week we got some really fascinating material from one of you listeners.
Yeah.
And this document you sent, it's called The Unfinished Task.
Yeah.
And, what struck me right away was the scale of this whole concept.
Uh,
It's not just talking about some local project, it's
right.
framing this like global endeavor, a worldwide mission to spread uh, a specific message, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's what's so compelling about this document, right?
Yeah.
It offers a specific perspective on the entire world, really,
Yeah.
And it prompts this question, like, what is this fundamental task?
Yeah.
How far along are we in actually accomplishing it? And it provides this, like, framework
Yeah.
for understanding global demographics and the presence or sometimes the absence of this message across these populations.
Yeah, and I was thinking, like, looking at things through this lens could really shift your perspective on stuff. Like why certain cultural divides exist,
Yeah.
or even like the currents that are kind of underlying the things you see in global news.
Hmm.
But I will say, it's a massive topic.
It is a huge topic, for
So
sure.
don't worry, we're going to try to zero in
Yeah.
on the most, the most interesting aspects, the
Wow.
parts that'll make you go, huh, interesting, without turning your brain to spaghetti.
Yeah, we want to get to that aha moment.
Exactly. Yeah, that clear aha moment.
Exactly.
Now, the document itself, the unfinished task, lays out a very specific viewpoint, right? It's deeply rooted in certain interpretations of the Bible, particularly around what's known as the Great Commission.
Hmm.
And it brings in a lot of research into global mission efforts to kind of, to define just how big this task is,
Right.
what makes it so challenging, and even some potential ways to approach it, which I think that's what makes it so interesting.
Yeah, it tries to be practical, too.
Exactly.
It doesn't
There
just
you go.
define a problem.
Yeah.
It tries to provide some solutions as well.
So for this deep dive, our goal is to unpack how this document defines this unfinished task.
Yes.
We want to understand the categories that it uses, to describe the world in relation to this task,
Hmm.
and what it sees as the major obstacles that are preventing its completion.
Yes.
So let's get right into it.
Let's do it.
What exactly is this unfinished task according to this document?
Okay, so the very first thing this document emphasizes is how it views the world.
Okay.
So instead of primarily looking at the world through the familiar lines on a map, those country borders,
Right.
it focuses on peoples.
Peoples. Okay.
And by that, they mean ethno-linguistic groups, groups of people who share a common language, and often a very interconnected culture.
Okay.
So think of the difference, for example, between someone who speaks Mandarin Chinese and someone who speaks Cantonese.
Right.
Even though they might be from the same country, their language and often their cultural nuances are quite distinct.
Right.
And this document sees them as separate peoples
Okay.
for the purpose of this task.
So it's less about political boundaries
They're-
than more about these deeper, cultural and linguistic ties.
Yes, precisely.
Right. That makes sense.
So the core of this unfinished task, as they define it,
Yeah.
is reaching those specific peoples, those ethno-linguistic groups
Okay.
who have not yet been evangelized.
Okay.
That's their central focus.
So then how do you even start to measure something that sounds so massive? How do
Yeah.
you even quantify reaching all these different peoples?
Right, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So they look to this concept from the Bible known as the Great Commission,
Okay.
which actually appears in several different places throughout the Bible.
Okay.
We find it in the Gospels, like Mark, Luke, Matthew,
Right.
even in the book of Acts and John's Gospel.
Okay.
And each account, each version of this Great Commission offers a slightly different emphasis.
Mm.
And the document uses all of these to try to piece together a more complete understanding of this task.
Okay. Got it.
It's kind of like putting a puzzle together,
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
using all these different pieces to get the full picture.
Okay, so let's start with Mark's version. Then
Yes.
what's the key message there?
So in Mark chapter 16, verse 15, it says, "Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation."
Okay.
And based on this, the document points to a really striking statistic, that today, the number of people who have never even heard of Christ
Wow.
is 6 times greater than the entire population of the world when Jesus actually gave that command.
It's hard to even imagine that.
It's wild, right?
Yeah.
And they state that currently, around 1.68 billion people have absolutely no access to the gospel message.
So even with all the global communication we have today, the internet and everything,
Right.
there are like entire populations larger than continents that have never even had a chance to engage with. You know, with these ideas, it's kind of shocking when you think about it.
Yeah, it really makes you rethink what global truly means
Yeah, for sure.
in our interconnected world.
Okay, so wow, 1.68 billion with no access? That's a massive number.
Yes.
So based on Mark's emphasis on reaching every person, the unfinished task is about reaching at least, what, like 4.51 billion people?
That's the calculation they arrive at based on that specific metric, yeah.
Okay, wow.
But then Matthew's account of the Great Commission in chapter 28, verses 19 and 20,
Okay.
focuses on a slightly different aspect.
Okay.
It talks about making disciples of all nations.
Right.
And here's where that concept of peoples that we talked about earlier becomes really important.
Okay.
Because the original Greek phrase used in this passage, pante ta ethne, actually translates more accurately to all peoples.
Okay.
Not just the political entities that we typically think of as nations.
Oh, that's an important distinction.
It is, right?
So it's not just about having a presence, like followers in every country. It's about fostering this like deeper discipleship within every single one of these ethno-linguistic groups.
Exactly. And they point out that out of the 12,862 identified peoples worldwide,
Wow. Okay.
2,161 of them, which makes up, by the way, about 30% of the entire global population.
That's huge.
It is, have very little to no access to the gospel.
Still a massive, massive portion of humanity.
Yes.
And Matthew emphasizes like making disciples, right?
Yeah.
Which implies something more than just someone saying, you know, I believe.
Absolutely. It's much deeper than just an intellectual assent.
Right.
You know, just saying, okay, I believe this.
Yeah.
The document really stresses that making disciples involves, and this is a quote from Matthew 28:20, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you.
Right. It's about putting it into practice.
Exactly. It's about instilling a way of life based on these teachings, not just an intellectual acknowledgement.
Yeah, like really living it out.
Yes, exactly.
So it's more than just awareness. It's about truly following these teachings.
That's right.
Okay, so we've looked at Mark and Matthew.
Yep.
What about Luke and Acts and John?
Yeah.
How do they contribute to this definition of the task?
Well, they all kind of add their own unique piece to the puzzle, right?
Okay.
So Luke's gospel in chapter 24, verses 46 to 49, also reinforces this idea of the message reaching all nations.
Okay.
And starting in Jerusalem. Like that's where it all begins.
Yeah.
And then the book of Acts in verse 8, it gives us this, the geographical scope, like how far this mission should extend.
Okay.
It says, to Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth.
Wow, so it's really encompassing.
It is very expansive.
Okay.
And then finally, John chapter 20, verse 21,
Okay.
offers yet another perspective where Jesus says, as the Father has sent me, I am sending you. So it suggests this very comprehensive sending,
Right.
mirroring the very nature of Jesus' own mission.
I see. So it's really multifaceted, this whole task.
It is.
It's not just about, reaching individuals or countries. It's about engaging all these different ethno-linguistic groups
Exactly.
worldwide and actually nurturing real discipleship within those groups.
Yes, it's about establishing a lasting presence, not just a fleeting visit.
Okay, so it's a very thorough mission, this unfinished task.
It is a very comprehensive mission.
Okay, so to kind of understand where different parts of the world stand in relation to this, the document talks about a collaborative effort by several mission organizations, right?
Yes, it does.
The International Mission Board, or the 80, 2000 and beyond movement.
Yes.
They've come up with this system for categorizing the world's peoples based on, how much access they have to the gospel.
Exactly. It's a way to assess where things stand.
Okay.
And to prioritize efforts.
Okay, and these categories are the last frontier, the outpost frontier, the harvest frontier, and the homestead frontier, right?
Yes, those are the four main categories.
Okay, we're definitely going to dig into what each of those entails.
We'll break them down.
But first, I think it's important to talk about the environment in which this task is taking place.
Right, the context.
Yeah, because the document does discuss the various barriers, right?
Absolutely, there are significant challenges.
Yeah, so what are some of the major barriers that we're talking about here?
So they identify several key categories of barriers: religious, political, sociological, linguistic, and even geographical.
Okay, wow, that's a
It's a
lot.
complex landscape, right?
Yeah.
But among these, they emphasize that religious factors often present some of the most significant and also deeply rooted obstacles
Okay, that makes sense.
to the spread of this message.
Okay, so let's start with those religious barriers.
Okay, sure.
Uh, the document highlights several major world religions, right?
Yes, it does.
Let's start with Islam, I think.
Right.
What's the context there?
So Islam, with over 1 billion followers, primarily in around 50 Muslim majority nations,
Right.
Places like Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Middle East, is obviously a major context to consider.
Mm-hmm.
And the document points to this 20th century Islamic revival
Okay.
as being partly a response to things like Western secularism
Okay.
and economic imperialism, which I think is an interesting point.
Yeah.
It's not just about theological differences, it's also about these historical and cultural factors.
Right. Right.
And what's important to note is that for many Muslims, religion isn't just this personal belief.
Yeah.
It's really a way of life. It's integrated into their politics, their cultures.
Yeah, it touches on everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this comprehensive worldview contributes to what the document calls, this kind of Islamic fundamentalist revival.
Okay.
And this is where some of the challenges come in. Because fundamentalist Muslims, according to this document, they often view missionaries with suspicion.
Mm.
They see them as, bringing division and disruption.
Right, and they often link it to other things like, education or political involvement, right?
Exactly, yeah. They see these Western influences as potentially harmful.
Right, and sometimes even like, aid and development projects,
Mm-hmm.
they see those as a cover for something else.
Right, they might question the motives behind them.
Yeah.
And there's this perception that Christian missionaries are, being deceitful in their approach.
Okay, so there's a real lack of trust there.
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
And this is compounded by the fact that conversion from Islam is seen as a very serious offense.
Yeah.
It's almost like betraying your community,
Yeah.
betraying your identity.
Right, like
Yeah.
a deeply personal betrayal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
So politically, because their faith is so interconnected with their governance and social structures, they don't hesitate to use various means to prevent people from even considering Christianity.
Right.
So that presents a very real challenge.
Yeah, it's not just a difference of ideas. It's a real barrier to even having a conversation sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so moving on then to Hinduism.
Okay.
This is the third largest religious group, right?
Yes.
Primarily in India and South Asia, but also with a presence in expatriate communities worldwide.
That's right.
What are the specific challenges in this context?
So Hinduism, with around 650 million adherents,
Okay.
presents a slightly different set of challenges compared to Islam.
Okay.
And it's interesting because the document mentions that several other major religions, like Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism,
You're right.
actually all have their roots in Hinduism.
Okay.
So there's this long history and interconnectedness there.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's also worth noting that Hinduism has had some influence in the West as well.
Right.
Through movements like the New Age, Hare Krishna, and Transcendental Meditation.
Okay.
So it's not completely foreign to Western culture either.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one key barrier in reaching Hindu populations seems to be the perception of Christianity.
Okay.
Hindus often see it as a Western religion, a white people's religion.
Right, right.
And in India specifically, they often see it as the religion of the poor or those in lower social castes.
Right.
Which can lead to this perception of it being somehow inferior.
Okay, so there's a social element to it as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
But interestingly, the document also highlights this contrast with Islam.
Okay.
Hinduism generally exhibits a lot of tolerance towards other faiths, including Christianity.
Okay.
They often see all paths as potentially leading to the divine.
Okay, so it's more of a live and let live kind of attitude.
In a way.
Yeah.
But this tolerance is also intertwined with an expectation that eventually Christianity will be absorbed.
Okay.
And integrated into this broader Hindu worldview.
So it's almost like we'll accept you now, but eventually you'll come around to our way of thinking kind of thing.
Yeah, something along those lines.
Oh, okay.
So the resistance, according to the document,
Yeah.
often comes from concerns that Christianity will undermine their long-held family and sacred traditions.
Okay.
They also have this perception of it being a foreign religion, this white man's religion.
Right, right.
And they're also concerned about the exclusive nature of Christian claims.
Okay.
The idea that there's only one specific path to truth.
Okay, so that's a different kind of barrier than we saw with Islam.
Yes, it's more about preserving their own traditions and worldview
Right, right.
rather than actively opposing another faith.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so next we have Buddhism with around 300 million followers, mainly outside of India.
Yes.
What are the challenges in this context?
So the document points out that from its very origins, Buddhism has focused on this idea of an individual's journey towards enlightenment and essentially making the concept of a creator god irrelevant.
Okay.
So for Buddhists, this idea of a god who became human and then was resurrected, like Christians believe about Jesus.
Right.
It's a really difficult concept to reconcile with their core beliefs.
Yeah, it goes against their fundamental understanding of how the world works.
Exactly.
Okay.
And furthermore, their ways of thinking, their cultural norms, are very much shaped by Buddhist philosophy,
Right.
which can make it a real challenge for communication.
Yeah, it's like you're speaking different languages, not just literally.
Exactly. It's a clash of worldviews.
Yeah.
So if your whole understanding of well-being, for example, is focused on personal enlightenment without the need for a divine being,
Right.
then the idea of a God who intervenes in the world, like through a resurrection,
Yeah.
might seem completely foreign.
Right, like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly. It just doesn't compute.
Okay, so that's another layer of complexity.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, what about traditional religions then?
Right.
The document refers to them as primal religions.
Yes. These are basically belief systems that exist both within the larger established religions,
Right.
like the ones we've been discussing, and also as distinct kind of localized practices.
Right.
More tribal or indigenous beliefs.
Okay.
Now, the document notes that historically these haven't presented as significant a barrier to Christian missions
Okay.
compared to the major organized religions we've talked about.
Right.
It's not to say they're not important or complex in their own right,
Sure.
but in terms of this global task, they haven't been as much of a widespread obstacle.
Okay, got it.
So that's something to keep in mind.
Okay, and finally, in the religious context, we have atheism,
Yes.
with over 1 billion people identifying as non-religious or actively opposing religion.
That's right.
That's a huge number.
It is a significant portion of the global population.
Yeah.
And the document states that nearly 3/4 of this population resides in East Asia, with a majority being in China.
Okay.
There are also significant numbers in the former Soviet Union.
Right.
And while precise data can be hard to come by,
Sure.
the document suggests that the influence of atheism remains strong in these regions.
Yeah.
After decades of communist rule,
Right.
where religion was actively suppressed. And Albania is an interesting example.
Okay.
Even though they now allow religious practice, the population is still largely atheistic.
Wow, so those decades of, state-sponsored atheism really had a lasting impact.
It seems so, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And the document highlights this, the dominance of atheism in China as a substantial barrier
Right.
to the spread of religious belief.
Okay, so the religious landscape it's a mixed bag, right?
It is very diverse.
Yeah, you have active opposition in some places, perceived incompatibility in others, and then, fundamental differences in worldview, and
Yeah.
even just the outright rejection of religious belief.
Exactly. It's a wide spectrum of challenges.
Okay, so what about the political barriers? How do those play a role?
So the document notes that the political systems that are most resistant to the spread of this particular message are often the ones that are very closely intertwined with a specific religion.
Okay, so there's that overlap.
Yeah, exactly. And they cite Islam in Saudi Arabia and Buddhism in Bhutan as examples.
Okay.
And the underlying principle here is that when a major religion is deeply connected to political power, it tends to resist the introduction and growth of other belief systems.
Right.
Often leading to restrictions on religious freedom.
Right, so it becomes a matter of, national identity almost.
Yes, in a way.
Yeah.
And this can also be observed in contexts where Catholic or Orthodox traditions have strong political alliances.
Right.
So it's not limited to just those two examples.
Okay, yeah, it's more of a pattern then.
Yes, a recurring pattern. So, yeah, we see how deeply ingrained religious beliefs can be and how they can create these really significant hurdles.
Right.
But it's not just about individual beliefs, right? The
Right.
political systems themselves can either facilitate or actively hinder
Yeah.
the spread of this message.
And then there's also just the very practical barrier of language.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you can't communicate effectively, it's going to be a major obstacle.
It is, and the document emphasizes that there are still approximately 3,900 languages
Wow.
that lack any translation of the gospel.
3,900, that's incredible.
It is a huge number.
Yeah.
And to truly connect with people on a heart level,
Yeah.
the message needs to be presented in their heart language.
Right.
The language that they understand most deeply
Yeah.
and that they most closely identify with.
Okay, so these are some significant hurdles to overcome.
They are, for sure.
Yeah, but the document also talks about various global trends
Yes, it does.
and how they kind of intersect with this unfinished task. Some of them seem like they could impede progress,
Yeah,
while others might actually create new opportunities.
that's a good point. It's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
For instance, refugee situations can make it more challenging to focus on reaching core populations
Right.
within a specific people group
Okay.
because people are displaced, they're scattered.
Yeah, you don't have those stable communities anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the upheaval, the trauma of being a refugee
Right.
can also, in some cases, lead people to be more open
Okay.
to new ideas, new sources of hope,
Right.
including religious ones.
Okay, interesting. So it's like out of that, that difficult situation, a new openness can emerge.
Yeah, it can be a catalyst for spiritual seeking.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about the increasing trend of urbanization?
Right.
More and more people are moving to cities all over the world.
They are, yeah.
How does that affect things?
So urbanization, on the one hand,
Yeah.
it offers this easier physical access,
Right.
You have large concentrations of people.
Right, all in one place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the document suggests that individuals living in these urban environments
Yeah.
can sometimes be harder to reach on a personal level.
Okay.
They're often very focused on economic survival, career advancement,
Right.
the fast-paced nature of city life.
Yeah, there's so much going on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can make them less receptive to religious messages.
Right. It's like they're just not, not tuned into that frequency.
Yeah, they're preoccupied with other things.
Yeah.
So with over half of the world's population now residing in urban areas,
Right.
finding effective ways to connect in these contexts is becoming increasingly important.
Yeah, it's a new kind of mission field.
It is, definitely.
Okay. The document also mentions the impact of tribalism and ethnic conflict.
Yes.
Using examples like the tragic events in Rwanda and Bosnia.
Right.
How do these things play into this whole unfinished task?
Well, those kinds of conflicts are obviously major setbacks for any kind of outreach.
Yeah.
They cause immense suffering, displacement, and these deep divisions within communities.
It's like the opposite of what you're trying to achieve.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
But the document also raises this interesting point,
Okay.
that these profound tragedies can sometimes lead people to seek solace,
Right.
reconciliation, a deeper sense of meaning.
Yeah.
And that can create a spiritual openness
Okay.
where there might not have been one before.
So it's like out of the ashes of these conflicts, something new can grow.
Yeah, a new receptivity to spiritual things.
Okay. That's a hopeful thought.
It is a glimmer of hope
Mm-hmm.
in the midst of tragedy.
Yeah.
And that's something that this document really emphasizes,
Okay.
finding these opportunities even in the most difficult circumstance.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
And then there's poverty in what they call the last frontier.
Right.
How is that, playing into this?
So the last frontier, which we'll discuss in more detail later,
Okay.
is basically where most of the world's poorest people live
Okay.
and a majority of illiterate individuals.
Wow.
And a staggering 92% of the world's population living in extreme poverty.
Okay, so it's concentrated in these areas.
It is, yeah. And while extreme poverty itself is a huge obstacle,
Right.
it also presents opportunities for ministry
Okay.
through things like humanitarian aid, literacy programs,
Right.
and other forms of practical care.
Right. Meeting people's basic needs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a way to demonstrate compassion in a very tangible way,
Okay, that makes sense.
and that can open doors for sharing the gospel.
Okay. And then there's nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
which is a really powerful force in many parts of the world.
It is.
How does that factor in?
Well, the document suggests that strong nationalistic sentiments can sometimes hinder the spread of the gospel,
Okay.
especially if national identity and loyalty become more important than religious commitment.
Okay, so it's like a competition of loyalties.
Yeah, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And this can lead people to resist anything that they perceive as a foreign influence
Okay.
or a threat to their national unity.
Right, they see it as an attack on their identity.
Exactly.
Okay, and then finally, globalization.
Right.
It's connected the world in ways that we've never seen before.
Absolutely.
But it's not without its downsides, apparently.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword.